All right, everybody. So today we are going to be talking through, and that's embarrassing. There we go. We are going to be talking a little bit about pricing. And as Alex mentioned, Patrick Campbell, I'm the CEO and founder of a company called ProfitWell. We build revenue operations tools for subscription and SaaS businesses. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what we do in a second. But my personal background is in econometrics and math. I'm a big nerd, as a lot of us are, and basically I've spent my career building economic models either for the government or for Google, and then started the company about 8 years ago. And the thing that I've learned, particularly over the past 7.5, 8 years, is that when it comes to something like monetization and pricing, it's one of these topics that sits at the precipice or the corner of uncomfortable but really important. And whenever you're building a company, whether you're a big corporate or you're a Johnny or Jane startup, a lot of times what ends up happening is these uncomfortable and important topics just kind of get pushed down the road. And so my goal today is to basically give you not only a framework for understanding and optimizing your monetization, but to give you a bit of an order of operations. And I think this is really important because you're going to get fired up about some of the things I'm saying, hopefully all in a good direction. You're going to want to go do things, and then you're going to go back to your business, and all of a sudden you're going to go, it seems like this is going to be too much work. Let me just send another ad campaign, or this is too much work. Let me adjust this email copy. When in reality, the work that we're doing here is actually, sorry about that. My phone just decided to take over there. But the work that we're doing here is basically it's that work that takes a little bit of extra effort, but actually has much higher payoff than some of the other things that you're doing. And so, with that, let's jump in. Everything will be shared afterwards, of course, so that you can keep things moving here. So first up, I already explained who I was. Just to give you some context on where some of this data comes from. At ProfitWell, we have a couple of different products. Our kind of core product is something called ProfitWell Metrics. This plugs into your billing systems or a Stripe, Braintree, Recurly, Paddle, whatever you're using. And essentially, once you plug in, it allows you to get your free subscription financial metrics. So churn cohorts, we enrich the data for free. We give you benchmarks, and we give it away for free for a few reasons. But the big thing that's kind of cool about this is we now have about 23,000 now companies using ProfitWell, which is really cool. And then we make money through a couple of different products that help with retention as well as with pricing. And the reason I'm giving you this context is because we've now seen inside more recurring revenue in SaaS businesses than anyone else out there. And we've been able to kind of study that data in aggregate and understand what's working and what's not, so that I can give you this kind of order of operations as we're kind of talking about here. So with that, let's start by setting the stage. What are we actually trying to do with monetization? And we're going to start at like the 30,000 foot or the 10,000 meter level, and then we're going to keep going down. So when it comes to monetization, the thing that you have to think about, and it doesn't matter what type of business you are, it doesn't matter what stage you are within your business, you are creating some sort of value. And because we don't have a barter economy anymore, we're not trading, goats for linen or something like that. What ends up happening is that you're saying, hey, this product or this value, even if it's a service, it's worth this much. So in that manner, what ends up happening is that your price and your monetization becomes the exchange rate on the value that you're creating. You get a little bit more brand equity, your value goes up. You get a little bit more kind of focus, your value goes up. There's a whole host of things that actually will help a lot here. And when we think about our businesses, what ends up happening is that those buyers that you have ends up being super crucial to this value creation. Because when you think about your business and you're driving customers to this point of conversion, you realize there's a lot of things that you can do in order to influence that value. You can change up who you target, how you target them, these types of things. You can obviously change up the actual product that you're going after, and you can change your packaging and your features. And then, of course, there's the actual price point, which is not only a brand signal, but is also something where you can actually see, this affect conversion, obviously. And to give you a metric and going a little bit deeper here that you should be focused on with monetization, it should be your revenue per customer. Now, you might measure this in a bunch of different ways: ARPU, average revenue per user, ACV, ARPA. It doesn't really matter how you measure it. You should measure it for the right point in your stage. But the more important thing is to make sure that that number is continuously going up and to the right, and that ultimately you're in a position where you can actually, have the first 90 days of that cohort, continuing to get better and better with those customers. And to go all the way down to the rails here, and we'll go even further, you can do easy things that'll affect this. You can adjust your value metric. You can increase your prices. Add-ons is one of the most underutilized things in B2B SaaS. And then there's obviously hard things, which, used to be easy, where you can go up market. You can do feature differentiation. There's a whole host of things that you can do. And the big lesson here to kind of TLDR this is that ultimately that revenue per customer is the name of the game. And most of you aren't playing it. And that's the crucial thing to take away here. And to give you a little bit of the impact before we get into kind of this order of operations is I'm going to scare you a little bit, or that's the goal, because over the past kind of 10 years, we as SaaS businesses, we've lost a lot of our power. In some ways, we are gaining so much because there's just so much knowledge out there and there's so many products out there. But that's also a bit of the problem when it comes to growth. When we were building companies in the early 2000s, the biggest barrier to growth was the building, because there just wasn't as much infrastructure, right? And then all of a sudden that got better, with the rise of the internet, as did acquisition channels. But all of a sudden we're in a market that's really, really dense. There's more competitors than ever. And in addition to that, it's getting harder and harder to acquire customers. To give you some data here, customer acquisition cost is up 70%. Customers that cost you 100 euros, 5-6 years ago, they're now costing you 170 euros today. The value of product has gone down, meaning, essentially that product that used to be able to sell for $1,000 add-on, that Salesforce integration on top of your product, that was an additional $1,000 per month. Because there's so much product out there and because there's just so much competition, that product, is now worth about 30% of what it once was. And this is because software used to be magical, right? You used to be able to put a login screen on a database and you were looked at as a god. Now, if it doesn't have good design, if it doesn't have good, support, all of a sudden your customers are really ungrateful, right? And this isn't to say they aren't happy, but it's harder and harder in this market. And we actually see this at NPS scores as well, which is a measure of customer satisfaction, where NPS scores, 5-6 years ago were about 34. And those NPS scores today are closer to 10, right? And no one is actually going to stand up and say that products are worse today than they were 10 years ago. And so, again, to kind of close this out a little bit, we are not getting really good at understanding value, and this is where pricing kind of comes into play in monetization. Because if you think about your business as 3 big growth levers: acquiring customers, monetizing them, and retaining them, you're not using these last 2 growth levers, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to now kind of get into not only teaching you like how to think about the pricing, but then we're going to get more and more tactical up until the end here. And we're not going to be able to go through everything, but I think the first thing to kind of understand is that you have to understand from a packaging perspective and even from a pricing perspective where value actually comes from your product. And right now, a lot of us, we hear things like focus on the customer, and then we come up with like terrible anecdotes that aren't even true about, well, Steve Jobs didn't talk to his customer, or Henry Ford said, the faster, if they would have said a faster horse, right? And, actual history shows that maybe some of these people, didn't say these things, but also that, GM, basically crushed Ford, after Henry Ford kind of said this, because he focused on different colors. They focused on, different makes and models of cars. And so the big thing I'm trying to get across here is that you have to be building the right product. And this comes down to packaging. And so let's get a little tactical, and I'm going to show you how to like think about your packaging. So the big thing here to kind of keep in mind is that whenever you think about a product, and it doesn't matter what it is, we're going to talk about a cup of coffee here for a second. You have 2 axes of value. The first axis of value is the actual features or the functionality of that product. And the second axis is basically pricing. And so whenever I have a product that I'm trying to go and figure out what is the packaging, what are the value propositions, what's the pricing look like, I want to look at that product on these 2 axes. And what I'll do is I'll actually go out to a subset of my customers, and depending on, how big of a decision I'm trying to make, I might just do qualitative interviews. Or if I'm trying to make a bigger decision, I might do like super quantitative and super research laden, data collection. But what I can do is I can go out and I can find out by basically asking folks what are their most preferred and least preferred features, that overall the most important feature for, let's say, a cup of coffee is something like taste. And I can find out that, people are pretty indifferent about temperature. And then things like country of origin are the least important. It doesn't mean that they're unimportant. It's just they're not as important in the context of all of the other features. And for you, even if you're not going to, go out and collect data right now, I think you should. But again, I know there's this friction and this uncomfortableness with pricing. You can just do the mental, modeling of your product or of your feature release that you want to do using this particular framework. Now, on the other axis, I can then go back and collect data from those folks who said taste was their most important. And I can find out that their willingness to pay is essentially 20 to 30% higher. And I can find out that the country of origin people, there's not a lot of them, but there are some people who find that as their most important. And I can find out that they're willing to pay about 30 to 35% more. Now, what this does is that if I find features or functionality that have high value relative to the other features and also high willingness to pay, that's a differentiable feature. If I find something that's low value but high willingness to pay, that's an add-on. Something that's or high value from a feature perspective, but low value from a pricing perspective, that's a core feature. And then my favorite quadrant, we don't really call it this, except for marketing, is the trash, right? And you have to build some trash, right? If you're a fleet management product, the mobile app is going to be trash, right? Like no one is going to value that or pay for it, but you still are going to have it. If you're an accounting product, invoicing, it's probably going to show up either like right here in core, or it's going to be slightly in trash because again, it just needs to be there, right? Now, what's interesting to just kind of show you how the market has changed. We went out to about 1,300 product leaders a couple of years ago, and we actually asked them, where they thought their features were on these 4 boxes. And we made sure they understood what they were looking at. And this is what they said for about 5,000 features. Using our Price Intelligently software, we then went out to about 1.2 million of their customers and basically, found out quantitatively where the value for features and where the value for willingness to pay was. And this is what we found. So it was one of those situations where we basically found out that our conception of where value is very, very off. And if your conception of value is off, you're probably focusing on all the front end areas of growth, which, you're spending half your budget on acquisition, either through sales or demand gen or whatever you're using. And you're not taking advantage of these other types of growth levers that exist. And so it's one of those things that I'm not here to make you feel terrible, but I think it's that piece of really thinking about your product from a value perspective. So that being said, let's get a little bit more tactical. What do we actually do? What are the things that we can do right now, no matter our stage? What's the most important thing that we can implement that kind of gets us that 80-20 effect when it comes to monetization? So the first thing to do, especially in B2B SaaS, and really I would argue even if you're consumer SaaS as well, is you got to get your value metric right. So your value metric is how you charge. So for someone like Intercom, they charge based on people that flow through the product. And Intercom, for the few of you who don't know who they are, they're the little chat bubbles in the bottom right-hand side of most of the internet. And they charge basically, if you have 1,000 people come in and chat with you, they charge you one price. If you have 5,000 people come in and chat, they charge you a different price. Now, Drift, one of their target competitors, they target sales folks. And essentially what ends up happening is they charge on a per user basis. So they basically give you unlimited contacts. And the thing to kind of think about here is neither one of these is right or wrong. It's just they're targeting different types of people. Intercom is going after sales support, marketing, a whole host of different personas, where Drift is a little bit more targeted just towards like sales and a bit of marketing. And the reason I'm showing you this is that you can have different types of value metrics depending on who you're targeting, even in the same space. But the important thing is that value metrics, what they do is they bake growth into your pricing. So put another way, and I'll say this again, towards in a couple minutes here, but if you do everything else wrong, but you get your value metric right, you actually will be pretty okay. And the reason for this is that growth tends to be much, much higher for those companies using value metrics. So the light green here, these are value metric based companies. The dark green here, these are folks who are just using feature differentiation. And essentially what you're seeing is that growth is about double. Now, the reason for this is that churn is really, really good. Someone might downgrade from 1,000 visits or whatever they're using to 500 visits, but because there's that scale, you never get that value differential so out of whack that they don't want to, basically listen to you, or they don't want to use your product anymore. And so here's some stats on that. You're looking at overall revenue monthly churn rate on the far left-hand side here for feature differentiated products, and then value metrics over here on the right. Essentially, your churn is about half when you're using a value metric. And then expansion revenue is baked directly into your pricing model. So essentially, when you're growing, and when someone on your that's a customer is basically growing and they're using more of those visits or more of those users, all of a sudden what ends up happening is you're in a situation where they're naturally upgrading without you even having to talk to them. So these are the same categories. And the TLDR here is that basically expansion revenue is double for those individuals who are using value metrics versus feature differentiation. And so the big thing here is I would stop everything when it comes to pricing. And even if I'm in the early stage, but even late stage, if you haven't figured this out yet, and the number one thing to do is figure out that value metric. Because again, if you get everything else wrong, but your value metric is right, you'll be okay. You don't even have to have the levels right. If you just get the right one, it'll help save you from, kind of kicking the can down the road, as they say, with some of the other pieces. The other big thing kind of in this phase one is making sure that you understand, at least at kind of a medium to high level, if not at a more granular level, who your market is. Because as you'll recall, when you're thinking about your business, everything that you're doing from your sales and your marketing down to your product and finance team is used to drive someone to a point of conversion or to justify the product or the price that you're offering. So if you don't know who these people are and you're just kind of throwing stuff up against the wall and just seeing what works month over month, it's really, really difficult to ever figure out your pricing, let alone to figure out your growth in general. And so we're not going to be able to go deep into this. I have a lot of content on this. I would say that maybe 15% of you are actually going to listen to me here on this particular piece. But this is the one thing that we see, like whenever we look at and work with Atlassian or Autodesk or some of these other people that are, really good bastions and really good examples of like fast growing and smart companies. They always have their personas and segments figured out, and they did it really, really early. And the reason for this is that even if you don't even collect data, and even if you just put something together that looks like this, and you can expand this into a spreadsheet, you can do a bunch of different things. But even if you put these profiles together, and you don't collect any data, it helps you directionally make sure you're not just like spraying and praying, as they say, and just building for anyone. It makes sure that you're having these conversations internally where our head of product wants to build something. And I go, wait a minute, we said we were going after Meredith here, but that seems like it's a Steve feature. And that allows us to kind of center that particular conversation. Now, when we started building ProfitWell, so we're a bootstrap company of about 70 folks in Boston, Salt Lake, and Argentina. And so when we were just 12 folks and we had this Price Intelligently product and we were starting to build the metrics product, we originally wanted to charge for it. And so this is what our personas originally were. We thought, oh, our lifetime value for Steve would be this, Meredith would be 30,000. It'd be great. Everything would be awesome. Now, what was really interesting is that we then, based on some qualitative kind of feedback in the market, we then went out and decided, okay, we need to actually validate or collect some data. And we went out, we went through kind of this pricing research process, which I'm happy to share some more information, afterwards to go deeper on this. And we actually discovered that this is what our personas looked like. And for, to kind of skip to the end here, basically our lifetime value was the same, if not a little bit more than our customer acquisition cost. And for Meredith, basically we were spending more money to acquire him or her than we would actually be, getting over the lifetime. Right. And I guarantee you, there is some sort of persona and some sort of like profile that you as an exec or you as a founder have a hunch because you read an article, you listen to a podcast, something, and you think that's the future, right? And it's not that your instincts are wrong. Your instincts are right, but you have to look at the finer details of those instincts, because if you're going to go spend $30 million that you raise, or you're going to spend 18 to 24 months going after that persona or building that product, you got to kind of hedge your bets a little bit and do a little bit of research. For us, it was, I think 12 hours total of research across a couple of weeks, and it cost us like $3,000, I think. And basically, we saved ourselves 18 months because we knew, okay, we either have to stop building this product because it's not going to work. We have to go freemium, which was, a working theory that we had, or we needed to go up market to people who were going to pay more, but then they have high expectations, and therefore, they need to, like have a lot more cost in terms of actually building out that product. And again, we were bootstrapped, and we have nothing against raising money. It just was, it doesn't make sense for us. And so make sure you know those segments. Now, speeding up a little bit, let's grow up. I'm going to go a little bit faster here, just so that we can get through a couple of cool things and everyone can take away something here to use. So the first thing is, and I think this is especially good for European companies in particular, make sure you're internationalizing or localizing your pricing. And the reason for this, or what I'm saying is make sure your price, at least your currency symbol, is different in the EU versus the US, obviously, versus the UK and wherever else you're selling. And the reason for this is, one, people like to buy in a trusting environment. And because of that, they typically will have a little bit of pause if they're purchasing something that is in the different currency symbol. It's just a natural thing as humans are, like, oh, am I gonna be protected? These types of questions, these types of things come up. I think in the next like 15, 20 years, there'll be a lot of people who this isn't as much of an issue for, but for now and for the foreseeable future, that's a big thing. And you should also make sure that your price is different in different regions. So to give you some data on why this is so powerful, basically over here on the left is the control. There's no localization. One step up is just cosmetic localization. So the currency symbols are different. And then up here, these are all companies that are basically doing region based. So the price is different. It's 100 euros in EU, and then it's $200 in the US, right? Which even with exchange rates and things like that is more money, right? And the reason for this too is that there's just different willingnesses to pay in different regions. So for example, you're looking at about 1.5 million data points here in willingness to pay relative to the US where we're based. And so you'll see here that basically the Nordics are typically willing to pay about 30% more than those in the US. Now, this is across a lot of different types of products. I do see some variance when you test this on a product by product basis, but historically, this is what we typically see. And then Eastern Europe, which some folks here are on, you're typically about 10% less than the US. And there's some products where I've seen that it's like a significantly less. But that should be like a good signal that you need to make sure that you're pricing differently. Personally, just as an anecdote, we have a couple of pieces of software that are from based in Eastern Europe, even in Ukraine here, and it's one of those things where their original prices I didn't trust. I didn't trust that they were going to be able to do something for $20 a month. That my alternative was probably $300 to $400 a month in the U.S. Right, and I kind of took advantage of that, where I was like, okay, let me talk to them and let me make sure we trust them and these types of things. But I told them, like, you need to charge us more because it's a trust thing, right? And I think that the EU, and I say European companies in general, and just a lot of non-US companies as well, you have a little bit of an insecurity where, oh, our products aren't going to be good enough, oh, it's a little too salesy, these types of things. And I don't think that's the case at all. And I've traveled a lot and spoken a lot in Estonia and other Eastern or Nordics, as well as other Eastern countries. And it's just one of those things that, like, you have to kind of like stand up and do a little bit of this research to make sure that you have that differentiated pricing in the right place. And so localizing your pricing, it's also a really good starter project if you're a larger corporate. If you're a larger corporate and basically, pricing is a little bit crazy internally because of politics and these types of things, it's one of those things where this is a really good project to kind of start with to, get your billing system in order, make sure you wrangle the right people and get some momentum. A couple other things, and I know this is a really boring point, but it's a really important one. Establish a pricing committee. You need a pricing process. Normally, we recommend a quarterly process. The committee meets in week 1, and I'll tell you who it's made up of in a second. Then a marketing manager or a product manager goes off for 20% of his or her time and basically does a bunch of research, comes back in week 4 to the committee. Committee makes a decision. Depending on the gravity of that decision, goes and, does some, different pieces here, and maybe does some extra analysis, and then implements those changes, tracks, and analyzes. And the reason this is so important is because politics internally, and I don't care how great your culture is, there's always politics because, again, this is an insecure thing for people, pricing. It's really important to have everyone in the room. So product sales, marketing, and corp dev finance, if you have customer success or leadership and product marketing, they should be in the room as well. The main decision maker should typically be in marketing or product. They're typically closer to the customer. The incentives are aligned there. But the other thing to really think about is making sure that these folks don't get pulled in at the very end of the process. I've seen this so many times where sales isn't talked to until like, hey, we're going to do this pricing change. And then sales can get on board if they were kind of involved, but now they're really insecure about it because they have to go get their troops to basically push things forward. And now they want to delay it another 6 weeks so they can investigate and they can do their types of things because they weren't part of the process. And so the big thing here, make sure people are in the room, and then deadlines and decision makers. I know this is a super boring point, and even if you're two people, just it's fine. Just you're the committee, the two of you, put a calendar invite that goes every 3 months, and maybe in the early days you snooze it for 1 quarter or 2 quarters, but just make sure you get into this groove of the process and making different improvements, because from your packaging, your add-ons, your positioning, all these different things go into your monetization that are so much beyond the actual price point. So to close this out, a couple of rapid fire. I have the data to support all of these. So if you want the actual data, it's just, I can't go through it in the deck just given the time here. But a couple of things for you to keep in mind: design, support, and brand, they correlate with higher willingness to pay. And I know some of you are like, well, duh, that's great. But this was not as obvious like 6-7 years ago. 6-7 years ago, the difference between someone who had high affinity for your brand or design or support and someone who was neutral or someone who was negative wasn't that much of a difference. Now, high affinity is typically plus 15-20% for good design, good support, good brand. And then negative is like plus or minus, 10 to 15, even up to 20%, depending on which of these three you're looking at. So it's just one of those things. These things are important now because they're now differentiators in a very, very crowded market. Value props. This is something that like I don't think people think enough about. Even if you're a B2B company that doesn't have like a high traffic, meaning you're a high dollar amount product, test your value props. Again, this wasn't as big of a deal 6-7 years ago. Now it's like plus or minus about 20%, depending on the value prop that you're using. And to make it really practical, like this is the H1 on your website, whatever you're using there. And then the other thing, and I think this is really important, particularly because customer success is kind of rising and then becoming, it's becoming fully legit inside a lot of organizations. This is not a churn solver. A lot of people will hire customer success and say, oh, our churn's going to go down. That's not what they're there for. That's where your product and support teams are there for. Customer success, it helps with expansion revenue. It'll help a little bit with churn, don't get me wrong, but the correlation is very weak for churn between those who have customer success and those that don't. But expansion revenue, those who have customer success typically have much, much more expansion revenue than those who don't, obviously because someone's focusing on it, but that's kind of a little bit of a takeaway here. So with that, I think I'm almost at time, if not a little bit over here. Maybe we have time for one question. But before we get to that, Q&A, I'm at patrick@profitwell.com. If you have any questions at all, want the pricing book I wrote, want some of the other stuff, have some questions about the data, don't be afraid to hit me up. Sometimes it takes me a little bit of time to get back to you, but right now is kind of like inbox clearing season. So my inbox is like very pristine and at zero right now. So don't be afraid to flood it, even if it takes me a little bit of time to get back to you. But with that, let me get my keyboard working here again. Do we have time for a question or two, or no, Alex?
Yeah, no, we've got time for. I can see there's a great question there from Dan Harmson. Do you still price in the local currency if the currency is not stable? Your ARR might get killed in USD terms if the currency depreciates. That's a great question. Second question: do customers not feel ripped off when they see that prices in other countries are lower? How do you answer?
Yeah. So if the currency isn't stable, so really it depends on how, and I didn't get into this, it depends on the proportions of your customers, right? So if I have 100% of my customers in this non-stable region, I have to make a judgment call, right? Now, if it's very unstable, like the government might collapse and, inflation might go amok, like you're selling in Zimbabwe, 10 years ago, I would price in a different currency, right? But if it's more like, oh, it's going to fluctuate, kind of like how the British pound as well as the euro did, with this, I don't want to say the B word because I feel like we're kind of beyond talking about it as much, but, when Brexit, was kind of happening. But then I would still price in that particular currency, and I would take the float on, or the net that would happen on me as a company. Now, you got to make the judgment call. I would say localization is really important when you have more than, let's say, 20% of your customer base outside of one particular region, which a lot of European companies, that's what you have. Now, your second question, do people feel ripped off? So it's one of those things where from a technical standpoint, you want to set it up so that if I come from a particular region, I'm only seeing my price, right? I'm only seeing my currency. So it's not like you have a drop down menu and all of a sudden they see different prices and these types of things. But this gets into a little bit of a philosophical, kind of conundrum, right? Now, you're basically doing what airlines do. You're basically doing what other folks do, and you're pricing based on different types of people or different types of times and these types of things, right? And so I've found that most of the time people are very reasonable with, oh, the price is different if they find out or there's a message board or something like that. They're very reasonable because they get that the standard of living and these types of things is very different in Eastern Europe. The cost of living is very different than in the US, right? It's just a very, very different, even if the standard of livings are actually the same, right? And so long story short, I think, it's one of those things that I just wouldn't go too granular. I wouldn't be like, this part of Warsaw is this price and this part of Warsaw is this other price. That's not going to work out just because the technology doesn't exist to make that work.
Awesome. Well, Patrick, if you have time, no pressure. I mean, there is another question in the stage chat. So if you were able to hop onto the stage chat and answer that, but really appreciate you speaking at this event, and hopefully we can do it in person and online next year. So hope, fingers crossed for Dublin. But thanks so much, Patrick Campbell.
I'm already booking my ticket, so it's happening. I'm just going to be in Dublin. It's going to be great. All right, we'll see you. Bye now.
Cheers. Thanks, Patrick.